It's time to look at Lossless Scaling's frame generation in Star Citizen again, this time, very excitingly, with some latency testing. There has been a recent update to the software that promises better quality, performance and latency, Lossless Scaling Frame Generation 3.0. And again we ask, can this little £5 Steam program fix all of Star Citizen's performance woes? Well, probably not, but it is pretty impressive. Now, frame generation is obviously a very hot topic at the moment. Nvidia is heavily pushing the tech with its 5000 series cards, mainly because they don't perform that impressively without it. And I do get comments on the old videos about lossless scaling from people who use it and absolutely love it. But on the other hand, I also get comments from people who tried it out, they hated it, and they asked for a refund. So it is a mixed bag. In this video, I want to go pretty deep and look at who this is actually for. Do you need a good base frame rate, whatever that means in Star Citizen? Can this be used at all when you can only hit 30 FPS? What is the latency hit for using frame gen? And what sort of gameplay is this even suited to? As always, this frame generation stuff is pretty hard to show in a 60 FPS YouTube video. So what we've got is some 120 FPS footage that has been slowed down so that you can see the difference. Starting here with lossless scaling ×2. So in theory, the base frame rate is 60 FPS here. But in reality with Star Citizen, we can't quite maintain that, but you're still getting an idea of the doubling with the FPS counter in the corner on the left. And on the right hand side, it's native footage. So there's no frame rate cap. So at points it would go above 60 FPS, but in this section here, definitely not. But you should be able to see a general smoothness with the lossless scaling footage. If we move to 25% speed, that should become more apparent again on the left with lossless scaling engaged. The frame generation is providing a smoother image, and without it, it's pretty juddery when you slow things right down. But one of the key things is that there is artifacting with lossless scaling. So we've got two of the different generations. So this was the kind of original one, 1.1 on the left, and then 3.0, the latest one. Now, if you look on the left, there is much more kind of artifacting going on, especially keep an eye on the edge of the screen. There's just garbling, weirdness going on at various points. The kind of the map at points will kind of do weird things, but actually, on the whole, for both of these, when you're using 60 FPS as your kind of base frame rate, things have always been pretty good, and really things are just getting better and better. So in this sort of scenario, when you're kind of smoothly going around a city like this, things look pretty decent, even on their oldest model. When you do slow it right down though, 25% speed, again, you should be able to see, keep an eye on, again, the left maybe is the best place to look, at the edge of the screen. There are moments where things just kind of go a bit weird. Those grates just went a bit funny there as you kind of come around the corner here. Keep an eye. It just sort of doesn't look particularly great. But again, this is slowed right down, and at full speed, it's pretty actually hard to tell some of this stuff, especially on the newest version. But let's take a look at what happens if you start at 30 FPS. A lot of people's computers started in hitting 60 is almost impossible. So let's lock it to 30 and you can see here what's going on. So again, lossless scaling, the newest version of 3.0, doubling up to 60 FPS. And again, you can see, hopefully even at 50%, that it is a lot smoother than just a native 30 FPS. Let's just look at how it's improved lossless scaling's frame generation over the different models or generations that they put out. We've got 1.1 looking pretty iffy at points on the left. There is definitely more garbliness and wonkiness going on, and it does look better. That each generation seems to have improved, as you kind of would expect, but it has to be said that 3.0 does look fairly impressive, even at 30 FPS. One of the new features, a bit like Nvidia, with the new version of lossless scaling, is that you can generate more than one extra frame. So obviously we've got 2 times, which is what we've been looking at, but now we've got the options for 3 times and 4 times, and even actually in the program, you can kind of do a custom one, so you can do whatever you want. But you can see here, again, looking at the smoothness, when you do 4 times, you're technically up around 120 FPS. Smoothness at 25% speed is very good. In fact, it looks, yeah, it looks great. I mean, again, keep an eye out for the kind of garbling, the kind of weirdness at the edge of the image especially. There's definitely issues with the image, but it is actually fairly impressive. And probably the key thing, if I run this at 100% speed, I mean, it's looking pretty good. You have to be really on the lookout to actually see the issues, again, towards the side of the image primarily. It is getting better and better with each generation. Let's, though, talk about latency, because it's all well and good, all this smoothness. The smoothness doesn't mean much if there's a massive latency hit. Now, Captain Tombstone, wonderful channel member, has got himself involved in this whole situation. He has actually provided some data to the developer who's made Lossless Scaling, and he basically showed in the graph on the Steam page that this latest version of Lossless Scaling, the frame generation, the latency here is better than the previous version. So what about in Star Citizen? Is it kind of worth using? Well, I think it's going to depend on how kind of sensitive to latency you are, but I have done some testing. Now, this is using a nice little box thing that measures light and latency and all sorts of stuff. There's plenty of videos out there that I can link below of what it is, but effectively it gives us the ability to measure kind of peripheral latency, like a mouse latency or monitor latency or game latency here. So we're using that. We are shooting a wall. We're using 20 shots in the magazine for this gun, and then it basically spits out the numbers and tells us what the latency is. So what I've done is a load of testing here with lots of different things. So first of all, here is just a overview of where we stand. Now, these numbers on their own don't really mean much, and I don't think you should necessarily compare them to a different game. The way that I've been testing isn't necessarily exactly the best way to get the best figures, but it should at least be consistent between all these different results. So you can see, obviously, as you drop your frame rate, the latency hit just in general goes up and up. When you start to involve lossless scaling, you can see again there is a hit, but it isn't absolutely massive. That one there from 30 FPS to 30 FPS with lossless scaling times 2, would you feel 12 milliseconds extra for an image that looks twice as smooth? That is going to very much depend on you, and as we're going to talk about in a minute, it's going to very much depend on the sort of gameplay you're looking to do. I don't really understand why the lossless scaling times 4 mode there has got less latency. That could just be some sort of wonkiness in the testing. At 50 FPS and 60 FPS, again, you can see, yes, there's an increase. Can you tell the difference maybe with that 60 FPS one between 71 milliseconds and 94? I personally feel like I can. So I'll show you some Star Marine stuff in a minute. I think there is a case to say that in certain gameplay, like I said, you can really feel that. Here's an interesting one. All of these targeting 120 FPS, with 60 FPS at the bottom is kind of your baseline for what you'd get at 60. You can hit 120 FPS from 30 FPS in theory by using the times 4 mode, and again from 40 you can use times 3, but the latency penalty is pretty major compared to if you were upscaling from 60 FPS. Yeah, it really, I think, for certain people that it will become unusable because of this. And finally, a big look at all of them with the native frame rate with the lossless scaling times 2 frame generation. If you were in theory at 60 FPS and you have doubled your frame rate with lossless scaling, you're still at a better latency kind of cost than if you were playing at native 30 FPS. So like I'm saying, it will depend on what you like, what sort of things you do, because as I'll show you now, I went into Star Marine. I am relatively decent at Star Marine. I'm not playing for a while, but you can see here, this first game is without any frame generation on. The frame rate is kind of around the 100 mark, maybe. And the ability to kind of just lock onto a target and feel relatively snappy, it feels pretty decent at this sort of frame rate. Star Marine and the whole Arena Commander stuff has got better gradually over the years, and with top range hardware you can get a pretty decent experience. But you can see I'm not struggling to kind of target people and shoot them. But when turning on lossless scaling, so what I've done here is I've kind of in theory locked it to 72 FPS, can't necessarily maintain that everywhere, and then doubled it. I don't know if you'll be able to tell, but there are definitely some artifacts around. Keep an eye out just as I'm moving around the screen. The faster movements, there's definitely more glitchiness, and you can see it in a way that when going around Lorville, you couldn't really see big glitches like this, and maybe that is because that's a relatively smooth kind of movement. It's not fast-paced, twitchy, it's kind of just walking around. And this is where I think certain gameplay in the game will work pretty well with this, and certain really won't. In terms of the latency, I could definitely feel it here. So even though, again, from 72, we're probably not at a bad latency to start off with, I could just feel a significant difference in how responsive it feels. You might see in some of the shooting that I've got here, sometimes I just cannot stay on target. It feels like I'm fighting the mouse. It feels like it just, there's a floatiness to it. There's just a general kind of uneasiness compared to when I wasn't using lossless scaling. And I think it's key to say that this is not for everyone who plays Star Citizen. If you are focusing on the fast-paced gameplay, I suppose anything competitive, FPS stuff, ship combat or racing maybe, for example, anything where latency is really important, I think you're probably going to want to stay away from this. I think for me that the latency hit in those sorts of things would be too much. But if I suppose you enjoy a chill session of salvage or maybe some cargo hauling, again, depending on how sensitive to latency you are, lossless scaling or just frame generation in general might be a way to give you a much smoother visual experience while you're playing the game. If you don't really care about the extra latency, having the game look twice as smooth can be great. And again, in the right scenario, with the right sort of frame rate, again, I think it's worth saying that things are better when you are starting from 60 FPS. But as you saw, again, in the right area, if you're playing at 30 FPS and you are upscaling maybe even 4 times, it looks visually pretty good. You just will have that latency. It's an interesting one. I'm fairly convinced that eventually CIG are going to bring frame generation into the game. So NVIDIA's thing, obviously AMD, you've got some driver level stuff that you can mess around with. This is so cheap in some ways, at £5 or whatever it will be in your different currency. For some of you, it will genuinely improve your experience, but for some of you, probably not.